If you'll join me, let's begin in the name of the Father. Let's try it again. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. All I have and call my own, you have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me. Amen. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, we have 3 objectives today. By the end of class today, you should be able to do these 3 things. If by the end of class you cannot do these 3 things, then I have failed you as a teacher. I'll do my best. Please do your best. Would somebody like to read number 10, please? Yeah, thank you, Josh.
Explain how businesses and governments cooperated.
Yes, when World War I happened and the United States got into it, we needed to enter the war on a bigger scale than we had ever entered any war. We had done a little bit of militarization during the Spanish-American War, but that was small potatoes compared to what we were going into Europe. So we needed to get that, and so it took business and government cooperation to do that, with some of its missteps that happen sometimes along the way. Would somebody like to read number 11, please? Thank you, Monica. Yes, we're going to talk about some of the ways that the war carried out at home. Some of the ways that we dealt with other Americans, and some of the ways that we dealt with people that we weren't sure felt so American. Would somebody like to read number 12, please? Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Yes, we're going to talk about the changing situation for African Americans and for women along the way in the face of World War I. So when you go home tonight and your parents say, "What did you learn in school today?" you don't have to look at them and say, "Nothing," like you've been saying since you were 8. Instead, you could say, "Well, Mother, well, Father, shall we explain how businesses and government cooperated during the war?" And they'll say, "Why, yes, child, that'll make a thrilling dinnertime conversation. You'll have something to talk about. How exciting will that be, huh?"
Yeah.
Very exciting indeed, yeah. All right, good. So let's begin. It's so exciting. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 10. And we'll talk about how the militarization happened. So we had to convert our industries from making consumer goods to making military goods. And it had to happen pretty quickly. And to do so, it took the leadership of a group known as the War Industries Board, the WIB, and it was led by this taciturn-looking man up here, Bernard Baruch. And the War Industries Board, its goal was to try to standardize production as much as possible, but also to get producers, factories, makers of things to switch to mass production techniques, to switch out of like individual craft production but into mass production, and also to standardize its products. If you could make similar things faster, then that makes things faster and more available and cheaper. Now, under the War Industry Board, industrial production, this was a successful piece of leadership. I think we can say that because industrial production in the United States increased by about 20%. It was, though, mixed results because we stopped making consumer goods, and we stopped, or at the same level, and it created a shortage of just stuff that people use in their lives because we switched from making, I don't know, hairspray. It's not hairspray, but whatever, and you start making bullets. Well, that makes hairspray rarer. There's not as much of it, so it drives up the price of it. And this was kind of one of the unforeseen things, is that the cost of living, just the consumer goods that we buy, got a lot more expensive because all of our factories were switched over to wartime production rather than... Hey, Scotty, come on. Good to see you. So switching over to wartime production meant that the consumer goods were rarer. The shortage of consumer goods causes price to soar, and it nearly doubled the cost of a lot of important goods. Besides factories, what's up, man? It's the same packet we've been working on? It is, yeah, good to see you though. Okay, besides the War Industries Board, you also had the Railroad Administration controlling the railroads. There were the fuel associations managing fuel, coal, petroleum, things like that. There was also a feeling that we needed to preserve some of the, okay, if we're running out of fuel, you do two things. You stop using so much and try to create more. And so the War Industries Board, like the fuel administrations, tried to increase coal and oil production, try to mine things faster, but also to get people to stop using so much. So electricity, the electricity we use in this room is actually from a coal-fired power plant. The same style of electricity we use today is the same style of electricity they were using. It's more efficient now, but it's still just made out of, we're burning chunked up dinosaurs basically to turn on our lights. In an effort to use less of it, they encouraged people to do, they called gasless Sundays. Don't go driving somewhere. Take a Sunday off, walk to church, hang out with people, don't use the car. Try to conserve gasoline. Or lightless nights. So don't turn on the lights at night if you can avoid it. If you don't need them on, just walk around in the dark. Don't bump into things. But it's an effort to conserve electricity, which is conserving fuel. Now, what does this mean for the worker? Well, if you have a sudden demand on production, if you have a sudden increase in demand in production, then producers, why don't you just go ahead and get one anyway? Okay, if you have a sudden demand on producers increasing production, that means that factory workers become more in demand, and we see that prices, wages go up. If you're in the factory business and factories become super important because we're going to war, then your job just became really valuable and the value of your work goes up. So we see that wages went up. Industrial wages rose by as much as 20%. That's a good raise. You get a 20% raise anytime. That's a good raise. But it also comes with increasing prices. And in a lot of ways, the price of living was going up faster than the increase in wages. And so even though you're seeing more money on your paycheck, you're also spending more money at every step along the way. Also, if you're a factory worker and you get a lot more demands put on you, you're working longer hours. And maybe your employer is hitting you so hard that the workplace becomes a little unsafe because you got to work so many hours, work so fast. And that combination of longer hours and unsafe working conditions led to labor strikes. And the labor strikes were real. In the years of the war, there were somewhere around 6,000 labor strikes. Sure. You okay today, bud?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, that sounds fine. Okay. Well, his pen blew up while he was... you can mop yourself off. Don't put that in your mouth. You'll die, but everything else is okay. Okay, we're not going to focus on Scotty. We're going to focus on class. Welcome back. So there was about 6,000 labor strikes during the years of World War I. That's a lot. The United States was only involved in World War I for a handful of months, really a couple of years tops. And 6,000 strikes is huge. Today, in the United States, it is rare to have one or two significant strikes a year, but 6,000, that's quite a bit. Strikes threaten, though, to derail wartime production. And if you derail wartime production, if you go on strike because you're sick of making bullets, well, then you're actually hurting America, right? Like you end up having real effects on the armed forces, and so this becomes an American problem, and you are subject to get drafted if you go and you don't cooperate with the rules of the War Industries Board, and a policy that was nicknamed Work or Fight. Subpoint C, food production. To help produce food and to make food more available for the soldiers. Woodrow Wilson set up the Food Administration under the control of a talented engineer named Herbert Hoover. Now, Herbert Hoover will later be a villain in American history, but for a while he looked like a real hero. Herbert Hoover was an engineer. He was a mining engineer. His job was to go find petroleum and coal, and he was very, very good at it. Herbert Hoover was born poor. He didn't have any money, grew up in a poor family, yet worked his way up to being independently wealthy by the time he was an adult. And he did it because he approached everything with a scientific outlook on life. And that he approached mining scientifically. And when he's named to be in charge of the food production for the United States, he approaches food production scientifically. He says, if we don't have enough food to go send to our troops overseas, then we need to do two things. We need to, one, produce more food, but two, quit wasting the food we have. This is a little, honestly, this is when I got to kind of reset my head on a little bit in 2019. Because the 21st century, food is cheap and plentiful. We have so much food. So much food, you don't feel bad at all about throwing away food. And I don't think that you should feel guilty about it. Food is available and cheap. In fact, today, at this moment, you are more likely to die from being fat than from being hungry. It is much easier to fat yourself to death than to be malnourished. I'm working on it right now. But it's like, so food is plentiful and cheap, but it wasn't always like that. That's a fairly rare moment in human history. It's only happened since about the 1970s, or about my lifetime, that food production has gotten so easy and cheap. During World War I, it was feeling that food needed to be safe to be shipped overseas. And so the Wilson administration worked to produce and save food, preaching what they called the gospel of the clean plate. They say you don't produce any food you're not going to eat, and eat all the food that you cook. And encourage people to save their food also, to have certain, pick a day of the week and go sweetless that day, where you don't have any candy or you don't have any desserts, because sugar was hard to produce fast enough and it could go be used in the war effort. Or wheatless, because flour was hard to produce and it couldn't produce it fast enough. So have a day where you don't have a bread item, or porkless days, or whatever, like a meatless day of the week. And all of that would be to try to drive down the price of food by driving down consumption of the food. Hoover also tried to increase food production. He encouraged people to go plant a backyard garden. They called them victory gardens. If your grandpa grows tomatoes in the backyard, well, you could think of him as like helping drive down the cost of tomatoes because it increases production. Now, truthfully, today, if you grow tomatoes, you probably spend more money per tomato than if you just bought it at Price Chopper. But all of that helps. When food was rarer, that was seen as a real way to go increase production and take some pressure off of the food system. And it was successful. It worked. These measures allowed Americans to triple the amount of foods that we were sending to our allies overseas. The war is also expensive. When the United States goes into World War I, we do not have the money in the bank to do it. And so we do two things. We pay for about a third of it with increased taxes, and 2/3 of it we pay for it by borrowing money. Okay, maybe you have wondered, we hear today that the United States is however many $1 trillion in debt. You think like, man, how did we, I get that we went into debt by overspending, but mechanically, where did the money come from? The money comes from a financial tool called a bond. And a bond is where a person agrees to loan the government a certain amount of money. They buy a $50 bond. A $50 bond has a 10-year maturity date to it. And so you pay $50. In 10 years, you get the $50 back from the government plus the interest it accrues. That's the way it works. That's how we get the trillions of dollars into debt. It's the same system that we used in World War I. But in World War I, there was a specific bond that was created. They called them Liberty bonds or war bonds that paid a better interest rate. So you could go and loan money to the government and do two things. You could get an actual investment that paid you cash, but two, actually support the war effort. You could be a good American and make money doing it. And so you saw people that were out trying to encourage people to invest in bonds. Yes?
Us being in debt, is that keeping us from anything ever?
There's a lot of answers to that question. And there's not a consensus answer from economists. There's some people that think that having debt is actually a pretty good piece of an economy because it allows the government to grow and control the money supply, which I think is true. But it also means that our interest rates, the stuff that I pay when I buy my house or go buy a car, are also tied up in government interest rates, and it doesn't really let the market set what the price of cash is. So there's a lot of answers to that, and there's not a real, I can't give you a straight answer because I'm not an economist, but there's a lot of answers to it. But we pay for 2/3 of the war with Liberty bonds or war bonds to do so. All of this needs to get Americans to be encouraged into the effort. And this came down to the job of this scowling looking man with the weird haircut up there. His name is George Creel. And George Creel headed the Committee on Public Information, which was basically a propaganda arm of the government. We don't like to think of the American government as being involved in propaganda. We like to think that that's not something Americans do. But during World War I, we totally participated in propaganda. And the Committee for Public Information, the CPI, introduced these ads and ad agencies to create paintings and posters and film shorts and sculptures and cartoons, all of which were designed to promote the war. So you have the United States government producing movies, encouraging the war effort, comparing Pershing to the Crusaders of past, going off to go fight the enemies of Christendom. You have Pershing going off to fight the enemies of America. And all of this is propaganda that comes out of Washington, D.C. There's in particular one group known as the 4-Minute Men. And the 4-Minute Men, that gets its name from the old American Revolution, the Minutemen, right? Like those of Concord and Lexington that could be ready in a minute to go fight the British. The 4-Minute Men were prepared at any moment to give a 4-minute speech on whatever the topic was that would support the war effort. So people were mailed out these bulletins of talking points and practice scripts. And if it came to them, they could say, hey, we're going to have a 4-Minute Men talk after our meeting today, or after school, or after church. Downstairs in the church basement, there's going to be one of the 4-Minute Men coming to talk to us about things like the draft. How does the draft work? Why is it good and patriotic to be drafted? Or rationing. Why is it patriotic to go have a tomato garden in your backyard? Or the bond drives, or more philosophical terms like the meaning of America. Those are the 4-Minute Men, and they're a product of the Committee on Public Information. Roman numeral number 11. Anti-immigrant hysteria prompted attacks on immigrants, and in particular those from Germany. The United States has just experienced a period of very fast immigration, and some of the countries that people came from are now our sworn enemies. And there was a feeling that you just couldn't trust Germans or people that had German families or had German names. And it was untrustworthy. It's like why you shouldn't listen to anything Mr. Keith tells you this week, because he's from the enemy and you just can't handle it, right? So anti-immigrant hysteria was carried out where people with German last names, I haven't really counted it up, but Kansas City has a big German ethnic population, at least people that came from Germany. I'd guess at St. James Academy, without checking, maybe 1 in 3 people at St. James either have a German last name or have some German ancestry. A lot of those people lost their jobs. They're just fired from work for the crime of having a German last name. Orchestras stopped playing music that was written by Germans or Austrians, which, if you know much about classical music, is a huge and important piece of the canon. This is like Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms and Bach, and you just can't we don't like those guys anymore. That's pretty tough on an orchestra. But they refuse to play any of it because they're the enemies. Schools stopped teaching German language classes, and librarians removed books from the shelves that were written by German authors. And things that had German names needed to switch to have good, proper American names. So things like Dachshunds. Dachshund, right? The little wiener dogs. Dachshund is, you have one. I used to have a Dachshund. It was great and terrible. They're like awful dogs or awesome dogs. But they do, because a Dachshund's a fighting dog. Its name is a German name, the Dachshund, which means the badger hound. They're made to go like fight. And they're actually, that long, narrow body means they go like into holes and would fight underground, and they're vicious animals. But they're like cute household pets. But I love this picture. I like dogs, but not this breed. And he's strangling this dog. The Dachshund's wearing a German helmet with the pickle strube up top. Yeah.
Are they born vicious or do they?
They're fighting dogs in the breed, but they're pretty tame. They will like, what's that? Kind of. They're less aggressive because they're 11 inches tall. And if you get mad at a dachshund, I mean, not that you should, but you also don't need to be afraid of them, okay? All right, so, or how about this? There are demons over here wearing the German hat with the skull and crossbones and the pickle strube up top. That means pickle point. I don't know why that was on the top of a German helmet. It's an old Eastern European thing. The pickle strube on top. But all of it is to like demonize the idea of German things. And so stuff needs to get new names. The Dachshund, they begin calling it a liberty pup. Because everybody actually kind of likes wiener dogs. They're kind of a ridiculous animal. And you're like, I kind of like this stupid thing. They are cute. They're dumb as hell, too. Like, they're just so likable. So they started calling him like, that's not a German name. That's a liberty pup. That's a dog I would like. A hamburger. You eat a hamburger. Nom, nom, nom. Hamburg is a city in Germany that developed the hamburger. But people stopped calling it a hamburger because you didn't want to be reminded that it was German food. So it switches its name to, for a while, they start calling it the Salisbury steak. Okay, now I remember as a kid, Salisbury steak, that's cute, that's nice. Salisbury steak was a thing that was like a grade school lunch menu at St. Joe, and it was a hamburger patty with gravy on it. And it's like, this is a hamburger, it's not a steak. It's a lie. It was good, but it's not a steak. But they had to change its name because Hamburg's a German city. Or a hot dog. It gets the name hot dog during World War I. We stopped calling it a Frankfurter from Frankfurt, Germany, because that's German, so we call it a hot dog. And today when you eat a hot dog, you're eating like the legacy of the anti-German World War I era. Subpoint B. In June of 1917 and May of 1918, Congress passes two laws that are hard to square with American sentiment. That's the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. So Espionage and Sedition Act. So espionage means spying, and sedition is like plotting to overthrow the government, basically treason. And I don't think there's anybody that thinks it's a bad idea to have laws against spying and treason. I think most people think like, all right, that's a legit law. I'm down with that one. But if the Espionage and Sedition Acts are used so far that you can't criticize your own government, then that begins also to be un-American. Congress passed the Espionage and Seditions Act, enabling courts to fine or imprison people for interfering with the war effort or by speaking out against the government. By speaking out against the government. If you stood on the corner outside of the White House and you held up a sign and you said, Woodrow Wilson is a poopy, poopy head, I mean, you should be able to do that. I mean, people might make fun of you, but it's not illegal. The First Amendment allows you the right to an unpopular opinion. Now, if you say, I'm going to kill Woodrow Wilson, that's a threat against the president, and you'll go to jail for that. But if you're just like, I really don't like that guy, like, you're welcome to your opinion. Except if you're at a time of war in World War I, that's sedition. That's the kind of stuff that gets the government overthrown, and that's illegal, and that gets people thrown in jail. If you go on a peace strike, I mean, the First Amendment allows you to do this. Peaceable assembly, it's totally okay. But if you're against the war and you want to go demonstrate against the war but in favor of peace, Under the Espionage and Sedition Act, that gets you thrown in jail. And a good example of this is Eugene V. Debs, our founder of the American Socialist Party, that guy that was the labor leader and the union boss. Eugene V. Debs protested against World War I, and they threw him in jail. And they left him in there for like 10 years. Eugene V. Debs served a 10-year prison sentence for his demonstrations against World War I. He also ran for president during that time. Debs ran for president like 5 times. And he got like 1 million votes from jail. Eugene V. Debs, this guy. Okay. Roman numeral number 12. African-American opinions on the war were divided, although they, like the general American public, generally supported World War I. Take, for instance, W.E.B. Du Bois. You remember W.E.B. Du Bois? We had met him as the author of It's All the Black Folk, I think is him. He's the guy that believes in the talented 10th, that black people and white people at the highest levels achieve equally. So he's an African-American civil rights advocate. And he says World War I is a legitimate cause and black people can support it. And it's totally okay if white people see black people supporting World War I because it will remind them that we are in this together, raise the profile of African Americans, and help our cause. That's the opinion of W.E.B. Du Bois. And it's not a widely held opinion, though. Take, for instance, William Monroe Trotter. He's a newspaper publisher. And Trotter says, wait a minute. African Americans should support World War I? African Americans aren't even allowed to fight in World War I. They're drafted, but rather than getting any of the glory of the battlefield, they've got to like peel potatoes and mop the boat. They don't get to actually like get any of the glory of combat or fighting because America doesn't trust black people to hold guns. And so William Monroe Trotter actually says that W.E.B. Du Bois, when he advocates for that, he's participating in a racist government. And he says people don't have to join a racist government. They don't have to go, if you're a victim of racism, and basically every black person of this era could claim that without anybody thinking twice about it, but if you're a victim of racism, you should not support a racist government. And this is President Woodrow Wilson, perhaps our most openly racist president. He says, you don't have to go support that. That's not a cause that demands your support. And he accused W.E.B. Du Bois of being an accommodationist, of making accommodations, of giving in when it suits him. Subpoint B. While we're on the subject of African Americans, I want to talk about something known as the Great Migration. Most African Americans lived in the American South, and there were not good jobs down there. You perhaps remember from 8th grade, when you learned about the Civil War, that one of the advantages that the North had in the Civil War was that they had an industrial economy. They made stuff. The South grew cotton. It was all farming down there. There was nothing else that there was. So during World War I, the best jobs were in factories, and so black people went where the jobs were. And this was at that time the largest internal migration of the country, where people living in one part would move to another. Booming with factory work. And factory work usually employs immigrants, but we're living in a time of an anti-immigrant sentiment where a lot of immigrants didn't feel that welcome. You guys okay? You may. I don't think it's about you. Okay. There, African Americans, when they moved north, found new factory work, but also found racism. Cities and parts of the world that did not have a significant black population suddenly had a black population, and a lot of cities weren't really ready to handle that. And African Americans found new jobs, but also new racial tensions. Subpoint C. Okay, so American men are going off to war. What are the women doing? They're doing what we often see happen during times of war. They're doing all of the jobs that men used to do. And some of them are not traditional women's work kind of jobs. Women took jobs in heavy industry that had been traditionally held by men. And partly because the men are off fighting in the war, and partly because there's really good jobs in industry. And if you can get that production, then you do it. So women became railroad workers and dock workers and bricklayers. They became coal miners and shipbuilders. A lot did voluntary work like war effort, serving in the Red Cross, working in nurses and Red Cross facilities, planting victory gardens, or selling war bonds. There were also, and this is worth noting, a significant number of women, particularly high-profile women, who supported the peace effort. Most of American history, the largest advocates for peace during times of war are women. They are a more reliable voice on peace. Men are a more reliable voice on war. It's not to say that like men always want war and women always want peace, but those are kind of the loudest camps for it. And you see people like Jane Addams. We know Jane Addams. She of like immigrant advocate fame, the foundress of Hull House. She also starts an organization in 1915 known as the Women's Peace Party to go try to encourage the peace effort. That fury of civic activity, this suddenly women coming onto the public stage, into the public sphere, is, I think we can say, what actually caused the 19th Amendment. This actually led to women's suffrage, that women were extended the franchise and could get the right to vote. Because it became very hard to deny women the right to vote when they're in civic life at this level. Subpoint D, our final topic is kind of a downer, but I think during the years of World War I, secrets don't make friends. 1919, went into effect in 1920. We're coming up on the 100th anniversary of it next year, actually coming into effect. Secrets don't make friends, Claire. Huh? You don't want to say it?
I don't have a secret.
Something's secret. Oh, I feel like I'm let out of the joke. Makes me sad. All right, well, during World War I, there was an influenza epidemic that raged through Europe. Basically, there was a huge case of the flu. And it's pretty ugly and gross and dangerous. It does not surprise me at all during World War I that Europeans had an influenza attack that was pretty crippling to it. People were I mean, it's a war zone. They're in filthy trenches. They're eating unsanitary food. They're living in filth. I mean, you got trench foot. You could imagine how viruses would spread. So something like the Spanish flu seems like a very obvious thing how it would take over Europe. It's less clear to me how it jumps to the United States as strongly as it does. It's not like I think Americans don't get sick, because I know we do, but that it came over and established in the United States as strongly here as it did there is kind of mind-blowing to me. And it was so much that 1 in 4 Americans, that's huge. That's epidemic level. 1 in 4 Americans faced the flu. What's that? 25%. You're pretty close. I know, right? Around and it was crazy. 500,000 Americans died as a result of it. Worldwide, as many 30 million people on planet Earth died. And then suddenly it disappears in 1919. Largely unexplainable why the virus just stops. And it just like turns off the conditions. But it was, I mean, 1 in 4 American population got the flu. It shocked the U.S. economy. When you already have not enough workers, when a quarter of them go sick, factories had to run shifts just to keep the doors open. All right, when you get this slide finished, your next task